Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Great. Okay, so I have been charged in the Division of Labor here today to speak about the presidential candidates. And before I do that, and that kind of relieves me from the burden of saying anything profound or insightful, because I'm just going to speak to you about the different presidential candidates, what they represent, maybe their bases of support, and so on. But before I do that, let me just say a couple of things. The first thing is that, you know, and this is somewhat obvious, but there is some important significance of this. This is the first time that Egypt is going to have anything possibly approaching an election, a presidential election with integrity. And what that means is that this is a new phenomenon, and the previous experiences that Egypt has had with presidential elections, namely the 2005 election, after the Article 76 being amended to allow multi-candidate presidential elections, because before that, you'll remember, it was only a referendum system, yes or no. What that means is that that doesn't serve as any kind of a previous model from which we can draw conclusions about the way these elections might turn out. You'll remember in 2005, there were two questions that people asked about those elections. Not who was going to win. We knew who was going to win. The two questions that people asked about those elections was, who's going to come in second? And secondly, what is voter participation or turnout going to be as a measure of how serious Egyptians took those elections? Because we knew that it was a charade to some extent. That's the first point. The second point is, I would argue that even the parliamentary elections that we experienced in Egypt in November, December, and then if you count the Shura Council elections into 2012, aren't necessarily an exact or automatic indicator of what the presidential elections are going to be. Those of us who study elections in authoritarian regimes and elections in Egypt in particular, particularly parliamentary or legislative elections, know that largely people vote in those elections not on the basis of ideology, not on the basis of political platforms, but on the basis of what the candidate can deliver to voters. And I don't mean what the candidate can deliver to voters in their district, right? No, what the candidate can deliver to you as a voter. Can he get you a job, or can, less likely, she get you a job? Can the candidate, the member of parliament, get your mother-in-law health care that's needed that you can't afford, and so on? And so then what I would argue is that the better than expected by many performance of Islamist candidates, the Muslim Brotherhood with 43% of parliament and the Salafi coalition with about 25% of parliament, isn't an exact indication of how well a presidential candidate will be who has the support of Islamist parties. Simple point. I think there's no question that, you know, if the Muslim Brotherhood nominates someone or who they support and so on, as well as the different Salafi parties, that'll have some influence, but it's not by any means guaranteed that the next president of Egypt will be someone who is an Islamist or has the support of Islamist parties uniformly. Okay. Just that. The second thing I want to say is, as Sahar has said, there has been some serious criticisms of the presidential election process. The possibility that the elections might be forged or fraudulent has been brought up. There's been serious criticism of Article 28 in the Constitutional Declaration promulgated on March 30th that does not allow any kind of appeal of the rulings of the High Presidential Election Commission, of course, who's headed by the head of the Supreme Constitutional Court, who was a Mubarak appointee from 2009 and has a dubious history of managing fraudulent elections in the past and so on. So there is some concern. And in fact, just yesterday or the day before, I can't remember, the Freedom and Justice Party or the Muslim Brotherhood made a statement that basically indicates their concern about the possibility of the elections being less than free and fair, and in fact that was met by almost an immediate response by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and so on. Okay. The last thing I'll say before I get into the different presidential candidates is that I was in Egypt in early March, and it was at that time that there was talk of, now I think no longer the case, of a consensus candidate, right? Of someone being put forward to the population who would appease or have the support of both the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces as well as the Muslim Brotherhood, and maybe some general appeal among the population at large. And the individual who was put forward, it was believed, because his name was brought up and there was a great deal of attention around his potential nomination, was someone named Mansour Hassan, who was a minister of information under the Sadat regime, who has some degree of respect and validity among segments of the population, who was appointed in December, I think it was, as the head of the advisory council by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, and so on. Now, he has recently withdrawn his candidacy, so that, goes out the window. Okay, moving on to the presidential elections and the candidates. Just a couple things to say before I go through the list of candidates who I think are A-level candidates as opposed to the B-level candidates, and then the others who have expressed their desire, the hundreds who have expressed their desire but really have no chance whatsoever to meet even the much more reasonable necessary requirements to put their names on the ballots that Sahar has mentioned, and so on. The first is, of course, all elections are, or many elections, I should say, including in the United States, less so in England, I think, are carnivalesque, right? And that's certainly the case with regard to Egypt. Big shows, big productions, all kinds of rumors, tremendous excitement, and so on. I would just remind you that Egypt's carnivalesque presidential elections are occurring amidst the backdrop of some uncertainty about the transition process, less than complete confidence in the mechanism and the institutions that have been put in place that are supposed to produce a presidential candidate. I thought I got rid of this. And so on. In addition to the serious issues that Egypt is dealing with, having to do with the economic situation in the country, the deteriorated security situation, at least perceived deteriorated security situation. It's a question of how deteriorated and so on. Okay, so getting to the presidential candidates. I would say that we can divide the presidential candidates into maybe, well, multiple ways, but one way would be three different groups. Those who have a serious possibility of actually making it as president, kind of then B-list candidates who are known across the country and have an experience in politics, and then, of course, the others, the hundreds of others who have expressed interest but really have no chance whatsoever. Another way to differentiate or separate the candidates would be, and this is not necessarily the most effective way, liberal, in some cases, pseudo-liberal candidates and Islamist candidates. But I'm not going to proceed in that way. I'm going to proceed in the order of candidates that have a potential shot of making it, as well as maybe the B-list candidates. Okay, number one, of course, we have here, I'm supposed to do what, slideshow or something? Slideshow, I think. Okay, we've got Amr Moussa, the most well-known, and I'm not going to spend too much time on Amr Moussa. I'll say that there are 5 A-list candidates, just very briefly so you know from the very beginning. Amr Moussa, Ahmed Shafiq, Abdul Minim Abu Futuh, Muhammad Salim Al-Awa, and Hazem Abu Ismail. I'll go through them very quickly. Amr Moussa I'm not going to spend that much time on because many of you know Amr Moussa, Egypt's former foreign minister between 1991 and 2001. Before that, he was Egypt's representative to the United Nations. He held the post of Egypt's ambassador to both Switzerland as well as India. He, of course, became quite famous in around 2000, 2001, when Shaban Abdul Rahim, the kind of folk popular singer, wrote the song, I hate Israel and Abakr Israel, Behib Amr Moussa, and I love Amr Moussa, and so on, because of Amr Moussa's very forceful statements on the question of Palestine, Palestinian rights, perceived to be standing up to Israel, and so on. And in fact, it was widely rumored at the time that Amr Moussa's transfer to the position of Secretary General of the Arab League, which he held from 2001 until he resigned recently to run for president, was because his standing among the Egyptian public was rising to the point that it actually threatened Mr. Mubarak, and that Mr. Mubarak wanted to eliminate him as a potential rival, removing him from the foreign ministry and basically we say, putting him on the shelf in Arabic of this less than significant Secretary General of the Arab League position. Okay, his basis of support, as it were. Tremendous name recognition. There's no question he is well-spoken, has a great deal of charisma. As I said, he's known for his forceful positions on Palestine. He was very much opposed to the Iraq War and U.S. policy with regard to the Iraq War in the Middle East generally, champions an independent Egyptian foreign policy, and so on. Now, unfortunately, for those of us who are interested in democratization, rule of law, real change in Egypt, I would argue that he doesn't represent any of those things, and he certainly doesn't represent liberalism either. You'll remember, he was definitely a part of the Mubarak regime. He was one of the nice faces of the Mubarak regime, but nevertheless a part of the Mubarak regime, who never in that period seemed to question or criticize Mr. Mubarak, never highlighted corruption or any of that matter. And in fact, he was sent, and there's some debate about this, he was sent during the protests to Tahrir Square. Arab League building is right there close to Tahrir Square. And there is different understandings or different interpretations of why he was sent. He says he went down, or why he went down to Tahrir Square, to support the revolutionaries. I was in Egypt in March after the revolution at an event in Cairo, made, with thousands of people crammed together to hear Amr Moussa speak. And as soon as Amr Moussa finished delivering his remarks, a young woman raised her hand and basically said, "You came to Tahrir by orders of the president to tell us to go home, and we're never going to forget that." And the point I'm making here is that he really represents a non-revolutionary, mainstream part of the establishment elements and so on. And I think he's somebody that the Supreme Council of the military could potentially do business with. Opposed very much by revolutionaries, by liberals, by Democrats, and by Islamists, as it were. Okay. Then, of course, we have Ahmed Shafik, who you will remember as Egypt's prime minister very briefly during the last days of the Mubarak regime. I forgot to mention Amr Moussa, 74 years old. Ahmed Shafik is 70 years old. He's a graduate of the Egyptian Air Force Academy, Air Force pilot.
Can you see your
I'm okay. He was a Minister of Civil Aviation from 2002 until 2011. He was named Prime Minister on January 29th, during the last week or so of Mubarak's presidency, and then, of course, left that office in March of this year. If we could no longer change that, that would be great. Just leave it like this.
Okay.
Keep the lights on. I'd appreciate it. Okay. He is thought to have, or potentially have, the support of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, right? Because he is a former military man, an Air Force pilot, also in a way is a member of the Ancien regime, hated by revolutionaries. He mocked them during the revolution, saying that most Egyptians aren't in Tahrir, they're at home, and so on. And so he represents, in some respects, I would say, the Ancien regime, military interests, the security state, counter-revolution. And then we have third Abdelminaim Abu Futuh, who is 60 years old, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood for decades, a student leader in the 1970s, formerly the president of the medical students in Cairo, then president of Cairo University in the early 1970s, famous because he had once a confrontation that was, I think, either televised or televised probably, with President Sadat, in which he held his ground when he was a young man and so on. A member of the Muslim Brotherhood's Shura Council up until 2009, in which he didn't win re-election at that point to the Shura Council, and believed to be a moderate, progressive member of the Brotherhood, part of the Wasatiyya, or the centrist movement in Islamist thinking that you can read about in Raymond Baker's Islam Without Fear. He recently got into trouble with the Brotherhood because in May of 2011 he announced that he was going to run, very much supported by younger members of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was going to run for presidency after the Brotherhood declared that they would not be putting forward a candidate and disallowing anybody of their membership from running for president. When he declared he was going to run, he was expelled from the organization. He's well-spoken, he's charismatic, as I said, he's quite popular among the Muslim Brotherhood youth. And this is what is most interesting in many ways about the Minhaj, is that now that Muhammad al-Baradei is no longer in the race, I would argue that young revolutionaries, people who genuinely believe in democracy, even liberals and so on, see in Abd al-Min'im al-Futuh the best chance, including many Coptic Christians, the best chance of genuine, substantive, thorough reform of the Egyptian state and society in a democratic manner. Many people who previously supported al-Baradei, including my parents, for example, very liberal, are now, who would never think of necessarily supporting an Islamist candidate, think that Abd al-Min'im al-Futuh represents the best chance for Egypt, as it were. Okay, the next candidate is Muhammad Salim al-Awa, 70 years old. Muhammad Salim al-Awa is an Islamist thinker and writer, a legal scholar and so on, graduate of Alexandria University, went to London to pursue a PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies in the 1970s. Highly regarded thinker, very known for championing the cause of some opposition groups under the Mubarak regime in a kind of moderate manner. He was the lawyer of the Wasat Party, Abu al-Mahdi's party, break off from the Muslim Brotherhood in the mid-1990s, attempting to get them in front of the court's legal status and legal recognition, as it were. Muhammad Salim al-Awa over the last several years has put his foot in his mouth and possibly revealed his anti-liberal feelings to some extent with regard to a number of statements he made having to do with Copts in Egypt, Coptic Christians, claiming that in a number of churches the Copts have weapons and are quite ready to engage in violence against their Muslim countrymen and so on. Also, it's believed that he has good relations with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. The next gentleman is Hazem Abu Ismail, here, 50 years old, son of a very prominent Azhari sheikh, Salah Abu Ismail, also who was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hazem Abu Ismail has an ambiguous relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. He ran on the Muslim Brotherhood ticket at least in 2005, I remember, maybe in 2000, in the Du'i neighborhood of Cairo. And in fact, I was there when it was announced that he won those elections in 2005 against a regime stalwart, Amal Osman, a kind of dinosaur of the Mubarak regime, who held the post of Ministry of, now it's called Social Solidarity. It was called at the time Social Affairs, forever. And after it was announced that he won, and after it was printed in the papers, Amal Osman happened to be a personal friend of Suzanne Mubarak, the regime changed the election results and he mysteriously lost. He's a Salafi. But he is a Salafi unlike many of the Egyptian Salafis in that he supported the revolution, he believed in political participation. As you know, the Salafis rejected political participation in formal politics, rejected demonstrations, rejected in opposition to the state up until really the middle of the revolution, as it were. He's also been, unlike many of the Salafis, quite confrontational with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, denouncing them, denouncing their practices, calling for civilian control of the military, has been to Tahrir on a number of occasions, and so on. Now, that's really it with regard to the serious contenders. How many, do I have a minute left or zero?
A minute.
A minute, okay. That's really left
for the 500 other candidates.
The serious, for the other candidates. The B-list candidates quickly are Hamdin Sabahi, founder of the Karama or Dignity Party, populist, charismatic individual who I think he's from Kafr Sheikh maybe. He was a former Arab Nasserist, broke off from that party, founded this populist, Arab Nasserist, socialist party, won a parliamentary seat in 2005. We have also Hisham al-Bastawisi, a member of the appellate court in Cairo, became famous in 2005 and 2006 because him, along with Ahmed Mekki, first called or criticized the election fraud that took place in those elections, and then as a result of that was punished by the Mubarak regime and brought in front of a disciplinary court to censor him. And in fact, I was there, in May, and there were demonstrations all across Cairo and many places across the country. This was the period where the judges were trying to push forward judicial independence. Hisham al-Bastawisi became nationally known, not charismatic, but a serious legal scholar, doesn't really have a chance, as it were. Muthaina Kamil, former TV anchor, TV personality, advocate for democracy, feminism. She's been supporting Samira Ibrahim in the virginity test case. She was on January 25. She was in Tahrir, very much with the revolutionaries. A great deal of integrity. Unfortunately, I don't think she has a feminist. Unfortunately, I don't think she has too much of a chance also. Khalid Ali, a young labor activist, labor lawyer, 40 years old. He heads the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights. He also doesn't have too much of a chance. Just the last thing I'll say, and I promise I'll finish here, just a couple of interesting dynamics with regard to the presidential elections. The first question is, will the Muslim Brotherhood run a candidate, right? Previously, the Brotherhood had said they weren't going to run a candidate, and that's why, in fact, they dismissed Abdullah al-Futuh. Over the last few days, there's been speculation that the Brotherhood might run a candidate. Interesting to see how that will play out. I think the Brotherhood will not run a candidate, and that is because the idea that the Brotherhood would run a candidate and then that candidate potentially lose would be incredibly problematic for an organization, its image, which puts forward this powerful, almost not invincible, but incredibly, and so on. The second thing is, this is 2 rounds of voting, most likely, right? You have to get 50% plus 1. That's an interesting dynamic, because it's unlikely that any of these candidates is going to get 50% plus 1 in the first round of voting. So that means that we're likely to see the top 2 contenders, whoever they might be. People are saying Amr Moussa, maybe Amr Moussa al-Futuh, depending on how the Islamists vote. That's another major dynamic, right? Where people, and so on. Will they vote for Mohammed Salim al-Awa? Will they vote for Abdullah al-Futuh? Will they vote for Hazm Abu Ismail? And then the last thing I'll say is simply alliances and vice presidents. There's been talk among a number of these candidates of getting someone as their vice president the way that happens in this country and so on to try to increase their base of support. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.